Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation Scoping webinar hosted by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. My name is Heidi Tate. I work in the Forest Resources Division of DNR, and I'm the project manager for the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. Also joining us tonight from DNR's Forest Resources Division are Andy Hayes, Division Manager, Kristen Olsen-Keen, Assistant Division Manager for Projects and Planning, Lisa Anderson, Trust Outreach Specialist, and Justin Schmall, a member of the Projects and Planning team and Project Manager for the Eastern Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation, which you can hear about tomorrow night. The topic of tonight's webinar is scoping for the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. The Sustainable Harvest Calculation is the process DNR uses to set a sustainable harvest level for a planning decade. The process we are beginning now is to set a sustainable harvest level for the 2025 to 2034 planning decade. I'll talk more about what a sustainable harvest is and how it is set during the presentation. Before I begin the webinar presentation, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. First, this live webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be available on DNR's Sustainable Harvest Calculation website within 2 weeks. Second, the purpose of this webinar is to provide information about DNR's project proposal and to answer questions related to the proposal. We ask that you submit your scoping comments using the online survey or US mail options that we will share later in the presentation. Third, in order to get everyone have an equal opportunity to ask their question and have it answered, DNR staff have elected to use the question and answer feature of Zoom. Questions may be submitted using the question and answer feature in the bottom of the Zoom window throughout the presentation. DNR staff will respond to all questions after the main presentation has concluded. A transcript of the questions and responses will be posted on DNR's Sustainable Harvest Calculation website. Attendees will remain muted during the presentation, so if you have a question, please use the question and answer feature. Chat has also been disabled, so again, please use the question and answer feature to submit your questions. If time permits, after the conclusion of the presentation and question and answer session, attendees who wish to ask a question live, that is verbally, may do so. We'll share more details on this option at the end of the presentation. If you have questions that come up after the webinar has ended, please send them to DNR staff identified on the Sustainable Harvest Calculation websites. A link will be provided later in the presentation. Lastly, please note that questions submitted during the webinar are not anonymous, and all submitted questions will become part of the public record. Before we continue, I'd like to ask if there are any elected officials attending tonight. And if so, could you please let us know through the question and answer feature?
Heidi, I see Lisa Janicki, the Commissioner of Skagit County.
Great. Hello, Lisa. Welcome, Lisa Janicki from Skagit County. Thank you for attending, and thank you very much for your service.
Yep, she says, I'm here.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Okay. Okay, so now next we'll have Andy Hayes from DNR's Forest Resource Division. He's our division manager, provide a brief introduction to start us off.
Good evening, everyone. It's been a long day. As Heidi mentioned, my name is Andy Hayes. I'm the manager for the Forest Resources Division here at DNR. The department is beginning the process of calculating sustainable harvest levels for both Eastern and Western Washington, with the goal that new harvest levels are adopted by the board before the next planning decade begins in July of 2024. This is an important process. Establishing and implementing the sustainable harvest level ensures the continued generation of trust income while simultaneously providing the important environmental protection and social benefits that we enjoy and expect on state lands. You may be thinking that we just completed a sustainable harvest level in Western Washington. Indeed, the previous sustainable harvest calculation was completed in 2019 for the decade of 2015 through 2024, so in the middle of the decade. While there were good reasons for this delay, it did present some real operational challenges for DNR staff. In addition, and as often the case, the previous sustainable harvest decision also prompted legal challenges to the Board of Natural Resources decisions. We're starting the process for the next decade now because we have an obligation under the law to evaluate our sustainable forest management every 10 years, and because we hope to avoid repeating these challenges. As we progress through this effort and learn more information, we will make adjustments as necessary. Seeking public input is a critical part of this process. During scoping, we are asking to hear from you. That's what this process is about. We use your input to establish the project scope, define alternatives, and do a comprehensive environmental analysis. So thank you for making the effort to be engaged. We appreciate your involvement and look forward to receiving your comments. I'll now hand the meeting back over to Heidi Tate, who will lead this evening's scoping webinar. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you, Andy.
Heidi, I just wanted to let you know that Tom Lannon, the Skamania County Commissioner, is also here.
Oh, welcome, Tom. Thank you for attending and thank you for your service. Appreciate you being here.
That's all we got. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. I'm trying to start my video again, but it's not cooperating. So there it goes. Anyways, thank you, Andy. To begin tonight, let's walk through the webinar agenda so everyone knows what to expect. In this webinar, we will provide a brief background on Washington State trust lands, information about the separate but concurrent Eastern Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation, and we'll cover 4 major topics related to scoping for the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. Specifically, we will introduce the environmental review steps required by the State Environmental Policy Act, or Cepa for short. We will describe what scoping is. We will review the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation proposal, and we will provide suggestions on how to make effective comments to the department during the scoping process and how to submit those comments. When the presentation concludes, we will verbally share questions submitted during the presentation and DNR's responses to those questions. First, I would like to provide some background on Washington State trust lands. State trust lands are lands held as fiduciary trusts for specific trust beneficiaries, such as schools and universities. On these lands, DNR produces revenue for its trust beneficiaries. The Department of Natural Resources manages 2.9 million acres of state trust lands in Washington. Of this acreage, approximately 2.1 million acres are forested. The photos on this slide show examples of the types of lands and the crops that are grown on state trust lands, including agricultural lands that produce crops such as apples, grapes, and wheat, as well as managed forest lands which provide a variety of wood products and ecosystem services. The forested trust acreage, the 2.1 million acres mentioned before, is shown on this slide. You can see that Western Washington forested trust lands comprise more than double the area of Eastern Washington forest trust lands, with approximately 1.4 million acres in Western Washington and approximately 700,000 acres in Eastern Washington. An important point here is that the sustainable harvest calculations only apply to those forested state trust lands. On these forested state trust lands, DNR produces revenue for its beneficiaries, primarily through the sale and harvest of timber. The major beneficiaries of state trust lands are listed on this slide. This is a breakdown of the approximate 1.4 million acres in Western Washington and 700,000 acres in Eastern Washington that I mentioned on the previous slide. Also, please note that approximately 12,000 acres from 3 smaller trusts are not shown in this table. The table on this slide groups the trusts into 2 types: federally granted trusts, which were created for Washington at the time of statehood. That's these. No, I missed my slide up. That's these at the top of the table over here. and the state forest lands, which were created by the legislature in the 1920s and 30s. The federally granted lands are managed for the trust listed in the table, and the state forest lands are managed for the counties in which they occur. The acreage of each trust lands is shown for both Eastern Washington and Western Washington. I want to highlight that the majority of state forest lands are located in Western Washington. I would like to clarify one point that may be confusing, and that is the difference between forested state trust lands and state forest lands. Forested state trust lands include lands under all trusts that are forested, while state forest lands refers only to those forested state trust lands that were acquired from the counties and are managed for those counties as trust beneficiaries. This pie chart shows the proportion of Western Washington forested state trust lands located in each trust and is a picture representation of the previous slide for Western Washington only. As you can see, the largest beneficiaries in Western Washington are the state forest lands, followed by the federally granted Common School Trust. Now that we have talked about the acres in each trust, let's talk about DNR's trust responsibilities. This slide lists examples of the trust responsibilities DNR must meet in developing the sustainable harvest calculation. DNR trust responsibilities are not widely understood. They include unique legal and fiduciary responsibilities that DNR is obligated to comply with in managing state trust lands. While all of these responsibilities are important, I want to highlight DNR's obligation to generate revenue and other benefits for each trust in perpetuity, as well as maintaining undivided loyalty to its beneficiaries, as these responsibilities impact certain aspects of the sustainable harvest calculation. For example, the obligation to manage for each trust in perpetuity means that DNR does not just consider current trust beneficiaries when calculating a sustainable harvest level, but also must consider future generations. This is why DNR considers future decades in the sustainable harvest calculation, not just the current decade. Also, while DNR must maintain undivided loyalty to the trust beneficiaries, DNR must also comply with state and federal law, as well as existing DNR policies. This slide lists 3 key policies and 1 statute that the sustainable harvest calculation must comply with, while also meeting DNR's trust responsibilities. The policy for sustainable forests is really a suite of policies that was approved by the Board of Natural Resources in 2006. The purpose of this suite is to conserve and enhance the natural systems and resources of forested state trust lands managed by DNR to produce long-term sustainable trust income and environmental and other benefits for the people of Washington, consistent with the fiduciary standards governing trust management. The multiple use concept is a statute that tells DNR to provide for public uses other than trust management activities when those uses are compatible with the obligations of trust management. This statute follows or allows for uses such as recreational trails, hunting, fishing, and other sports activities, and other uses to occur on state trust lands as long as these uses are consistent with trust land management. If they are not, they may be permitted only if there is compensation for the trust beneficiaries. The sustainable harvest level is derived from several statutes that direct the department to manage its timber asset on a sustained yield basis. The 1997 Habitat Conservation Plan is a policy that DNR implements to comply with the Endangered Species Act. It is a formal agreement between DNR and both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service to carry out operations and meet legal obligations for fish and wildlife species listed as either threatened or endangered under the Act. This slide lists the current members of DNR's Board of Natural Resources. This board is chaired by the Commissioner of Public Lands, sets policy that guide how DNR manages Washington state lands and resources. The Board of Natural Resources is the final decision maker on the sustainable harvest level for Western Washington state trust lands. DNR staff have started to provide information to the board about the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. The link on this slide will take you to the Board of Natural Resources website, where you can review meeting minutes and presentations on the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. Information presented during these meetings may be helpful in providing more detailed and updated information about the Sustainable Harvest Calculation as the analysis process moves forward. The Board of Natural Resources meets monthly on the first Tuesday of the month, except in August. Board of Natural Resources meetings are open to the public, are currently being conducted virtually. The agenda for these meetings is posted at the link in this slide prior to the meeting, and anyone interested in attending the meeting, including to provide public comments, is welcome. Next on our agenda, I'm going to talk about how DNR is conducting 2 concurrent sustainable harvest calculations, one for Western Washington and one for Eastern Washington. The light blue areas on the map in this slide are all of the forested state trust lands in both Western and Eastern Washington. DNR is conducting 2 separate sustainable harvest calculations in 2 separate public processes, one for Western Washington and one for Eastern Washington. This webinar pertains to DNR's Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. The forested state trust lands subject to the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation are shown in the light blue areas on the left side of this map. The link provided at the bottom of this slide will take you to DNR's Sustainable Harvest Calculation webpage, where you can find more information about both of DNR's Sustainable Harvest Calculations, including links to this webinar and one for the Eastern Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. You can also find links for submitting comments on both calculations and staff contact information for both calculations. This slide will be shown again at the end of the presentation. Our first topic related to scoping will address the environmental review steps required by Cepa and how they apply to DNR's Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. This slide outlines the environmental review steps for completing the environmental analysis on the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. Since DNR has determined there's a potential for the proposal to result in probable significant adverse impacts to some elements of the environment, Cepa requires DNR to provide an environmental impact statement, or EIS for short. The first step in the EIS process is to conduct scoping. Once the scope of the EIS is finalized, DNR will conduct environmental review and analysis before issuing a draft environmental impact statement for public review and comment. Following public comments on the draft EIS, DNR will then prepare and publish a final environmental impact statement. Elements of the environment mentioned previously are those elements of both the natural and built environment that may be affected by the proposal. The full list of elements can be found in Cepa under Washington Administrative Code 197-11-444. Cepa only requires analysis of the specific elements of the environment that may experience probable significant adverse impacts from the proposal. Some examples of these elements are geology, soils, vegetation, recreation, and cultural resources. DNR is currently in the conduct scoping phase of the environmental review process for the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. Once the comment period ends on December 9th, 2021, DNR will consider the comments received from the public when it determines the scope of the environmental analysis. DNR will collect and read all of the comments submitted. These comments will then be summarized into a scoping report, which will be published on DNR's Western Washington Sustainable Harvest website. The scoping report will also be shared with the Board of Natural Resources. DNR staff and the board will use the information in this report to finalize the purpose, need, and objective statements, which we will discuss next, and formulate alternatives to be analyzed in the environmental review process. In the draft EIS and final EIS, DNR will identify a reasonable range of alternatives for the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest level and analyze them for probable significant adverse environmental impacts to specific elements of the environment. The diagram on this slide shows other steps involved after the EIS process concludes. These steps include conducting a financial analysis and board approval of the sustainable harvest level. A financial analysis is used to provide financial projections to help the board understand how different alternatives affect DNR's ability to meet its trust management obligations. The board relies on the EIS process and financial analysis when making a decision on a final sustainable harvest level for the planning decade. The sustainable harvest level is expressed as the mean annual volume offered for sale by DNR in a planning decade. The timber volume is expressed in board feet. One board foot is equivalent to a piece of wood that is 12 inches by 12 inches in length and width and 1 inch in height. Okay, so now that we've described the steps involved in an EIS, let's go into more detail about scoping. Scoping is the first formal step in preparing an EIS, and it initiates the public involvement. Scoping occurs at the beginning of the environmental review process and is the phase where DNR asks for input on various aspects of the environmental review process to be conducted. DNR invites agencies, affected tribes, and the public to comment on the areas suggested in this slide and the next, and on any other environmental issues that DNR should consider during the environmental review process. Through scoping, DNR seeks comments in order to narrow the focus of the EIS to significant environmental issues related to the proposal and to eliminate issues that would have insignificant impacts or that are not directly related to the proposal. This process helps to focus DNR's analysis on the issues that are truly significant and avoids obscuring those issues with unnecessary detail. We are also seeking ideas for alternatives that DNR should analyze in the EIS, as well as any mitigation measures that address the potential environmental impacts of the proposal. On October 25th, DNR issued a determination of significance and requests for comments on the scope of the EIS for the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. This document, also referred to as the scoping notice, begins the scoping process as well as the comment period. You may have received a copy of this notice already, and it is available on DNR's Western Washington Sustainable Harvest website. Let's walk through a few of the components of the scoping notice. Within this document, you will find a description of the proposal, the deadline for submitting comments, an invitation to provide comments, and contact information for submitting comments. And this will be available on another slide later on too. So as I mentioned, the scoping notice contains DNR's proposal. Along with the scoping notice, we have included DNR staff's draft purpose, need, and objectives statement. The following slides will go through the proposal and the draft purpose, need, and objectives. DNR welcomes comments on the draft purpose, need, and objectives, and will consider comments received when proposing a final purpose, need, and objectives statement to the Board of Natural Resources. The final purpose, need, and objective statement is important because it will help determine the range of alternatives that will be considered in the environmental review process. As we saw on the slide showing the scoping notice, DNR's proposal is the establishment of a sustainable harvest level for forested state trust lands in Western Washington for the 2025 to 2034 planning decade. The purpose statement describes the goals of the proposal. The purpose of the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation is to recalculate a sustainable harvest level consistent with DNR policies, including the Policy for Sustainable Forests and the 1997 HCP, and with applicable local, state, and federal laws. The need statement describes why DNR is seeking to accomplish the purpose. DNR needs to calculate a new sustainable harvest level and determine the best course of action regarding the arrearage consistent with state law and DNR policy. For purposes of the sustainable harvest calculation, arrearage volume is the difference between the planned sustainable harvest level and the actual harvest level in a planning decade. In addition to the purpose and need, DNR also develops specific objectives that help fulfill the need and accomplish the purpose of the proposal. These objectives are used throughout scoping to help focus the range of alternatives to achieve the purpose and need of the proposal. Alternatives considered by DNR and analyzed in the EIS must help meet these objectives. The first objective requires DNR to incorporate new information into an updated forest to state model to calculate the sustainable harvest level that would inform the Board of Natural Resources when setting the sustainable harvest level. New information includes changes in the land base, changes in forest inventory, information concerning arrearage and its causes, and changes in technology. The second objective requires DNR to consider climate change as part of the affected environment, analyze climate change impacts and benefits of the alternatives, and identify possible mitigation measures that will reduce any or eliminate any identified adverse environmental climate change impacts of the proposal. The final objective requires all alternatives analyzed to be reasonable, feasible, and consistent with DNR's trust management obligation, existing DNR policies, and applicable local, state, and federal law. So going back to the environmental review steps, we are in the conduct scoping phase. Once the scoping comment period ends on December 9th, 2021, DNR will consider the comments received from the public when it determines the scope of the environmental analysis. DNR will collect and read all of the comments submitted. These comments will be summarized and they will be published on DNR's Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation website. The scoping report will also be shared with the Board of Natural Resources. DNR staff and the board will use the information in this report to finalize the purpose, need, and objective statements and to formulate alternatives to be analyzed in the environmental review process. This is repetitive of what I said earlier, but the important message is that it's important as we develop this final purpose and need statement, and your comments will help us do that. So we really want to let you know that this is, we want to hear from you.
Hey, Heidi, just to throw in this piece here. Unfortunately, the slides have an incorrect date on them. They say the close of the comment period is November 9th, but it should be December.
It sure does.
December 9th. So just for the group to know, we'll correct the slide before we post this on the website, but also just for everyone to know the close of the comment period is December 9th.
Thank you, Kristen.
Sure.
Okay, so the last item on our agenda is providing comments. DNR welcomes all comments relevant to the scope of the EIS. The following information is offered as a guide or suggested comment topic areas to consider when you are providing comments on the scope of the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation. Areas to consider for comment include the proposal description, as well as the purpose and need statement. Comments may address whether these are clearly described and provide suggestion for improvement if necessary. Other areas to consider for comments include alternatives that DNR should consider for environmental analysis. To be considered, these alternatives will need to meet the final purpose, need, and objective statement that the board approves following scoping. Useful comments may also identify any additional environmental information, studies, or reports relevant to the development or analysis of alternatives. Comments that address specific mitigation measures that DNR should consider to avoid or minimize impacts can also be useful, as well as identification of any element of the environment on which the proposal may have probable significant adverse environmental impacts. Please provide as much information as possible in your comments to help DNR define the scope of the environmental impact statement. If you are suggesting a particular approach or impacts to consider, please explain why. Providing peer-reviewed studies or reports that support your comment is also helpful to DNR in its analysis. As mentioned previously, Cepa provides a list of environmental elements that may be analyzed in an EIS in Washington Administrative Code 197-11-444. During scoping, DNR will identify those elements on which the proposal may have probable significant adverse impacts and merit further consideration and analysis. Comments regarding elements that need to be analyzed, why they may be impacted, and supporting studies or reports would greatly assist DNR. Comments that address factors related to environmental justice that need to be considered would also be useful for DNR in its analysis, including whether there are specific overburdened communities and or vulnerable populations that have the potential to be impacted. Now that we've described the environmental review steps required by Cepa, where we are in the process, the purpose, need, and objectives of DNR's Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation, and how to comment effectively, let's talk about how to submit your comments. Here's one very important note about submitting comments is the scoping comment deadline of December 9th, 2021 at 5 p.m. Comments on the Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation scoping can be submitted in two ways. The first is to use the online comment form to submit or upload comments, which can be found at the website address on this slide. We also accept comments mailed to the Cepa Center at the mailing address on this slide. In the last slide of our presentation, I want to share the link to DNR's Sustainable Harvest Calculation website, where you can find more information about both of DNR's Sustainable Harvest Calculations, including links to the recorded webinars, links for submitting comments, and staff contact information. We look forward to receiving your scoping comments via the survey and mail-in options. After the scoping comment period has ended, DNR staff will summarize the comments, and those will be available on the webpage and presented to the board. This concludes the PowerPoint portion of the webinar. If you are interested in viewing this webinar again, you may find it on the link on our Western Washington Sustainable Harvest Calculation webpage at the link on this slide. We will now focus on answering questions that were submitted by attendees during the presentation. Attendees are encouraged to stay for the question and answer portion of the webinar. However, for those that must leave, a transcript of the questions submitted and DNR's responses will be available on the Sustainable Harvest Calculation website within the next 2 weeks. So I will open the question answer. And it looks like I'm going to need my glasses. And we've got 6. Okay, the first 2 were from Lisa Janicki and Ton Lannon saying that they are present. So shows up as a question. So this first question is from Terry Wright. It says, how is anything sustainable given the climate crisis? Why not stop logging and allow the forest to absorb carbon? Isn't that a better use of trust lands, securing a future for our children and all? And Kristen responds, thank you for your question. Your comments are important to us. Climate change is just one of the important issues we consider associated with the Sustainable Harvest Calculation, in addition to other environmental impacts. Heidi is going to talk about how you can ensure that your comments on this process are incorporated into this scoping process. There will be a survey link shown at the end. The survey can be found at DNR's Sustainable Harvest Calculation website. It may be helpful to review the following statutes: RCW 79.10.300 through 79.10.340, which address DNR's obligation to set a sustainable harvest level. The next question is from Matt Comiskey. And the question is, comments are due December 9th, correct? The slide says today. And Kristen replies, yes, Matt, you are correct. The slide is incorrect. The comment period due date is December 9th. We will state this clearly at the end of the presentation. Thank you for pointing that out. The next question is from Doug Cooper. The question says, is it correct that the webinar explaining the process is tonight and the comment period closes today, November 9th? Again, sorry, I do apologize for that slide being incorrect. But yes, the comment period actually closes on December 9th. And then the next question is from Todd Myers. And the question says, given the concern about climate change and the governor's announcement on Saturday about the need for climate-friendly construction, will DNR be considering the impact of reduced harvest on the commensurate increased use of energy-intensive materials like concrete and steel? And the reply to that is, we are still scoping the environmental analysis, but this is exactly the type of information that we are interested in knowing from commenters. Please submit your suggestions in the comments. Thank you. And then another question from Todd Myers. It says, although the Western and Eastern Washington harvest calculations are separate, will DNR be considering the impact of the loss of timber infrastructure on the state's ability to address forest health issues across the state? And the reply to that is, this also sounds like a feature that you'd like DNR to analyze, so I recommend including it in your comments to DNR. Thank you. And that is all of the answered ones that I see so far. It looks like there might still be some questions coming in. Oh, okay, here's another one now. Here's a question from Jessica Randall. DNR uses language such as undivided loyalty to its beneficiaries, which includes future generations. I saw on your website that the economic benefit of DNR's public land harvests are their first priority. Are you willing to change this in our present pertinent issue of climate change and the incredible value of unharvested forests? It seems that the language of loyalty and future generations now includes halting or limiting harvest to help our future generations. And the reply to that was, thank you for your question, Jessica. We encourage everyone to submit your comments to the department within the comment period. Thank you. So again, that it's a good comment to send in if you want to put it into the survey that's on the website. And the next question is from Peter Goldman. And the question is, how will the sustainable harvest calculation process be revised in the event the Washington Supreme Court case rules for the plaintiffs, or if the DNR settles with the industry beneficiary lawsuits? And the reply to that is, hello, Peter, we will address the court's decision when it comes. However, at this time, we are not responding to active litigation, but you are welcome to contact the AAG's office for more information.
Okay, Heidi, there's a couple more questions here, and maybe what we'll do is, given that we have probably about 20 minutes left in the meeting, why don't we just go ahead and move to the portion of the meeting where we are giving folks an opportunity to share questions verbally. So I'll start off with the questions that have already been submitted but haven't been answered yet. And then after we get through that list, if there's still some time, we'll give some folks the opportunity to just share their questions live. But the idea would be that, if you are interested in asking a question verbally, go ahead and let me know in the question box. And then when I call your name, I'll ask Ralph to unmute you, and then you can answer your question. And we'll do the best that we can to answer it live. And then just be mindful that when you do get that space to ask your question, just try to keep it as brief as you can, so we can give as many folks in the meeting as we can the opportunity to ask their questions. But I'm going to start off with the list that we have here. So the first one that I have on the list here that was submitted a little bit earlier was from Mary Jean Ryan, and she's asking, when did the last decadal sustainable harvest calculation? Maybe what I'll do is, hey Ralph, can you unmute Mary Jean Ryan so that she can restate her question, because I'm not sure I understand the question yet. So I just want to give her the opportunity to ask it. Can you do that, Ralph?
Yeah, hi, this is Mary Jean Ryan. You in the presentation, you talked about something you called Objective 2. And as I understood it, it relates to climate protection being a consideration in this planning process. And so I was just wondering if that was new, if when you did the last plan for the last 10-year plan, if you had that Objective 2.
Oh, that's a good historic question. I mean, it's not like the last plan was that long ago. I'm looking up really quickly to see if I can check our previous EIS. Let's see. We had so in the previous EIS for the previous decade, we had an Objective 3 that said, consider climate change as part of the affected environment, analyze climate change impacts and benefits of the alternatives, and identify possible mitigation measures that will reduce or eliminate any identified adverse environmental climate change impacts of the proposal. So that was the previous decade. Heidi, can you flip to what Objective 2 says in this level, or in this decade?
Sure.
And just remember, what we're asking folks to do is to give us your comments on these objectives. So now you can see Objective 2 there. Sorry, Heidi, I feel like I interrupted you. Did you want to say something?
No, that's fine. I was just going to say it is actually the same objective that we had in the last calculation.
Okay, so right, so this would be something along with the need purpose statement, and these objective statements would be something that we would be very interested in hearing from the public on what your thoughts are related to these, how these objectives are stated. Okay.
Thank you. And you answered my other question, so don't bother answering.
Oh, okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next question that's on the list here. It's from Rod Fleck, and it says, is DNR expecting to have a sustainable harvest calculation that is done prior to the start of the next decadal period, and to have outputs by trust by county for all state forest lands? Also, how exactly will DNR track its harvest activities in relationship to its sustainable harvest calculation numbers to avoid the development of a significant arrearage over the course of any future decadal period? So, three-part question. First question, are we trying to get this done prior to the next decadal period? I think I feel sort of safe in saying we're going to give it our best shot. That's why we're starting our scoping now. But we also understand that there's a diverse number of opinions about these levels, and this is a long process, right? I mean, those of you who have followed the previous decade's process, we're producing a draft EIS, we're producing a final EIS, as Heidi explained, we're also producing a financial analysis. So there's a lot for the public to digest. There's going to be a lot for the board to digest, but we're going to do the best that we can. Are we going to have outputs by trust by county for all state forest lands? Yes, we're going to have many of our outputs by trust by county for all state forest lands. Rod, what specific outputs are you thinking? Are you talking about revenue or volume, or are you all talking about something else? Maybe Ralph, you could unmute Rod Fleck for this section.
Hi, Kristen. What I'm just wanting to make sure is this is a question that's been asked now for 3 harvest calculations, and it's particularly involving the Clallam County Associated State Forest lands, because while they can manage it, part of the western lands from state forest lands for Clallam County for management purposes, for trust beneficiary reporting purposes, and trust obligations in the OESF. This is the way we ensure we have the numbers for the OESF section.
Okay, so either Justin, Andy, or Angus, do you want to give any further description of the types of outputs that we'll have by trust and by county for state forest lands? Rod's example, of course, is Clallam County.
This is Andy. Yeah, I'd be happy to take a shot at it. Rod, I think we will be reporting. I mean, my anticipation is that we will report outputs in the way we have previously. So for the, sorry, I'm afraid somebody might need to be muted. Thank you. Yeah, I think we anticipate reporting outputs in the way we have in the past. So for the state forest lands, those would be reported by county. For the other trusts, they would not be reported by county. But if that's a comment you'd like to make and put in, if you'd like to see a particular analysis there, then that would be something that would be a good comment to put into the process.
Cool, thanks, Andy. And then for Rod's third part, also, how exactly will DNR track its harvest activities in relationship to its sustainable harvest calculation numbers in terms of, I think that means volume targets, to avoid the development of a significant arrearage over the course of any future decadal period? And so I know that Angus is giving sort of regular presentations to the board, but Andy, do you want to expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I would just say that this is something that we're continuing to work at getting better at. I think that, certainly having a harvest calculation completed on time, the beginning of fiscal year 2025 would go a long way towards our ability to, when we set a harvest level in 2019, it makes it difficult to quickly sort of catch up and get our reporting up to speed and to make sure we're meeting all of our deliverables that are set up in the field. There's little room for correction there. But I think we are looking to do that into the future. But if there's specific things you'd like to comment, again, I'll sort of direct the question. If there are specific things that you would like us to do, both in terms of policy considerations or in terms of analysis, I'd encourage you to put those into the comments.
Cool. Okay, so the next question, it looks like there's a comment and a question, which is from Don Parks, and he asks, will the sustainable harvest analyses include maps of stand age in the ranges of at least, whoa, my screen just moved, 40 to 60 years, 60 to 80 years, 80 to 100 years, and 100 to 120 years, and older than 120 years if such stand ages currently exist. And I think that this is the perfect example, Don, of some of the kind of information that we're interested in hearing from you. If you'd like to see that kind of data, that would make a lot of sense to put in the comments that you send to us. I'm just going to tie in your second question and then give Andy a chance to weigh in on those two pieces too. You ask, will the sustainable harvest calculation analyses address the various ranges of the efficiency of stand ages as they relate to the storage of carbon? So that's another good suggestion, and we would definitely be interested in hearing that from you in the comments. Along, with any other thoughts you have on that topic. Andy, did you want to add anything more to that?
Yeah, I'd just say that's a great question. I think we're going to be, as we always do take a look at what we know we've done in the past for analyses and look at new opportunities. An important part of this process is to identify other methods, literature, information that would inform our environmental analysis, including that on carbon storage. So I would definitely say that's something that should go into your comments.
Great. And then Mike Town is asking the question, how will the DNR consider the Deloitte report in their sustainable harvest? I think SHS is sustainable harvest calculation, but maybe I should double check that with Mike. Ralph, can you unmute Mike Town so that I can make sure that I'm hearing his question correctly? Is it how will the DNR consider the Deloitte report in the sustainable harvest calculation? I'm looking to see if Mike's still here. Yeah,
Yes,
Mike's here. Oh,
yes, that is correct. That was a typo.
Oh yeah, no worries. No, so I would say that, you know, so we're setting our sustainable harvest level because we're obligated by statute to do that. It's also a good idea. It's good stewardship of our land to set a sustainable harvest level. But in terms of the role that the Deloitte report would play, you know, certainly the sustainable harvest calculation relates to our largest asset class, which is the timber asset class. So I can see where the role that the sustainable harvest calculation plays within the Deloitte's assessment of our trust land performance. But I guess I would be interested, and I think we would be interested in hearing from you how you would think that the Deloitte report should be considered by the sustainable harvest but in this process, right? In the process of setting the sustainable harvest calculation or the sustainable harvest level. Andy, do you want to throw in some more thoughts on that one?
There we go. There's my mute button. I apologize. I was actually answering another question. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? I'm happy to answer. Sorry for that.
Yeah, totally, no problem. So Mike is basically asking. He's having us work our brains. How will the DNR consider the Deloitte report in our sustainable harvest calculation? So I just sort of summarized that from the perspective of the trust land performance assessment. You know, the timber asset class is our largest asset class, but we're obligated to set the level because due to statute and sort of also what's in good stewardship. But do you have any other thoughts to share? I suggested that he submit it to submit what he thinks the sustainable harvest level should consider related to the Deloitte report. But do you have any additional thoughts on that, Andy?
Yeah, no, I would just echo what you said. I mean, I think that there's many and various ways in which the Deloitte report, for those of you who haven't read it, is a very long and involved analysis. There's, I think, many potential connections to the way we manage our lands, and therefore sideboards on how we would set a harvest calculation. I think it would be important to be more specific. It'd be most helpful to us, Mike, if you were a little more specific in your comments, but to include some comments in your written submissions that would help us to understand sort of what parts of that Deloitte report you would like to see us apply. And I think we'd like to consider that.
Okay, and then Peter Goldman asks, I understand DNR's concern not commenting on legal issues, but I think it's fair to ask what DNR is doing differently this time around in the sustainable harvest calculation in light of the pending industry beneficiary lawsuits. And so, Andy, do you want to take that?
Sure. You know, I think the most appropriate answer to that is, I mean, this is not really the appropriate venue to be discussing ongoing legal challenges to the department. I think what's important here is that, as you know, we still, with these lawsuits ongoing, we have an obligation to continue to conduct a harvest calculation. And so, you know, if new information comes up, as it always does through a lawsuit or any other source, including these public meetings, then we're going to consider that in the process, right? So I think it's certainly premature, even if this isn't the right venue, to discuss that. I'll say I think it's premature to have that conversation, but as there are developments in those lawsuits, we'll consider that information as we move forward.
Great. Okay, and then the next question is that Don Parks asks, do I have this right? Okay, yes, oops. Will the sustainable harvest calculation address the dependency of specific rural communities at the county level on timber supply from state lands and compare those dependencies to communities that also utilize logs from private sources? So I think this is a good question. You know, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think that those are important points to incorporate into your comments to us. I know in our last round, in the context of the marble murrelet amendment, which was required, our EIS process had to meet both the State Environmental Policy Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. We conducted a socioeconomic analysis. In this EIS process, something that's newer to us is we have to conduct an environmental justice analysis, which is something that we don't know yet, but are very interested in hearing from the public on how we might go about that. Potentially, this kind of analysis could fall within that umbrella, but we don't know yet what we're going to analyze because we're interested in hearing from you. So I think if you view this piece, the dependency of specific rural communities at the county level on timber supply versus on logs from private sources, if you view that as being important to this, we're definitely interested in hearing that from you in your comments that you submit to us. Matt Comiskey is the next question here, has the next question here, and he asks, will the economic analysis be limited to the NPV calculation similar to the last one, or will there be an attempt to explore the larger economic impacts from the alternatives analyzed? And so, yeah, so you're referring to, so what DNR does is we conduct this environmental impact analysis or environmental impact statement. We write an environmental impact statement, a draft and final, and that complies with our State Environmental Policy Act. But we also conduct a separate analysis, which is what Matt's referring to, which is, we call it a financial analysis. And so I guess my response to your question, Matt, is that we would probably do something very similar to what we did in the last one, but I think it would be helpful to hear whether, your thoughts on how we might develop that further. So it sounds like you're interested in seeing that financial analysis explore larger economic impacts, which, that financial analysis is likely, we treated it as an appendix to the EIS, so it still could be a relevant comment to submit in this process. So I think it's an interesting, it's definitely an interesting idea, and I think you should definitely submit that in your comments. And then we have another question from Rod Fleck, which is, what improvements have been or will be made to, one, the inventory data and or two, the harvest calculation model? And so, Andy, do you want to respond to Rod on that, on improvements or changes to inventory data in the model?
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly that this is obviously a complex subject. We, as those of you who are regular followers of the department and what's going on, of course, that we were funded by the legislature to do some initial work on our inventory, our growth and yield, and our harvest model. We're scoping that work at the moment, and we'll be completing that work over over this biennium that we're in right now, which started in June and will go for 2 years until the middle of 2023. So, this is something that we're working on. It is something that we are looking to make improvements as we always are, but this is providing a real opportunity for us to invest in our data and our information for the next harvest calculation. So we will use the best available information at that time at the time which we have to make a decision. But I think, again, if this is something that Rod, you have some concerns about or some thoughts, including those in your comments, specifically what your interest would be there would be helpful as we consider what information goes into the model and how we conduct our analysis.
Thanks, Andy. And so, we're sort of at the end of our hour for this meeting, but I would give, if we probably have time for one more question, if somebody would like to ask a question. And if you would like to ask a question, please submit it in the question window. And I'll just wait for a sec to see if there is anyone who wants to ask one more question. Okay, so it looks like there aren't any more questions that folks want to ask. So Heidi has left up the slide that shows you the link to where you can find we've recorded this webinar, so that's going to be posted. She mentioned that. You'll see the links for submitting your comments. We will summarize these questions and answers and post those as well. And so this isn't, your last opportunity to talk to DNR. You can submit your comments, and then also remember we have monthly board meetings, so you can also attend those board meetings, and we will likely have regular presentations that we bring to the board. The next one will likely be a summary of the comments that we received during the comment period, in the form of a scoping report. So there are lots of avenues for you to be able to contact the folks who are going to be making the decisions, both on the analyses that we're producing and the final level. So with that, I will say, why don't we go ahead and close out the meeting? Thanks everyone for attending this scoping meeting. Just as a heads up, tomorrow night we have the scoping meeting for the Eastside Sustainable Harvest Calculation. So if you're interested in that, please come and attend that as well. And have a great night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.